of our campuses, I want to welcome you and just glad to have you joining us this morning. The clip we just saw, It's a Wonderful Life, it's another Christmas classic. It was released back in 1946, so it'll turn 80 years old next year. And even at 80, it still holds up. If you haven't seen this before, it's a great movie. You can watch it either in black and white or in color. And me, it's not very traditional, but I prefer the color version. And so if you haven't seen it, you should for sure go and check it out. But you might not know that it wasn't immediately very popular. It didn't become a classic until many, many years later. And what actually happened was it was an overlooked movie. Even despite the fact that it had a star in it like Jimmy Stewart, who plays the main character, George Bailey. It was kind of a forgotten and overlooked movie until the copyright was accidentally not renewed in 1976. And because it wasn't renewed, it meant that networks could replay the movie as often as they wanted, as much as they wanted, without paying anything for it. It was just free material. And so networks picked it up and began to show it on repeat over and over and over again for years during the Christmas holidays, and it made it and sort of solidified it as a Christmas classic. But again, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you today. And in my defense, it's an 80-year-old movie, okay? Like you should have watched it by now. But it's about a guy, as I said, named George Bailey, played by Jimmy Stewart. And as a young man, George had these big aspirations to go out and make his mark on the world. He was going to go to college and become an architect and design things and make a bunch of money and do all those things that young men dream of doing. But then his dad tragically passes away earlier than they had expected. And so George's dreams are put on hold so that he can take care of the family. And he takes over the family business and begins to go to work. And he imagines that eventually his younger brother, Harry, will come back and he'll take over the family business so that George can go and chase his dreams. But it doesn't work out that way. His life often doesn't. And instead, his younger brother, Harry, joins the military and, moves off to go and do those things. And George is stuck at home, sort of grinding away the years and watching his dreams evaporate. And he does do things. He gets married to his hometown sweetheart, Mary, and they build a life together. And George, they save and save and save to eventually go on this big honeymoon that they've dreamed of. But he never gets to do that either. And in fact, he does all the right things only to end up at the wrong destination. And that's sort of the summary of George Bailey's life. As the years go by, his business partner, it's actually his uncle, Uncle Billy, loses $8,000 and they discover it on Christmas Eve. And you may think $8,000 isn't a lot, but in 1946, that was quite a debt to have. And he didn't know where he was going to come up with the money, and he was facing legal charges and prison time and scandal and embarrassing his whole family. And he begins to realize that because of his insurance policy, he's actually worth more dead than he is alive. And he thinks about taking his own life. I don't know if you've ever been in a dark place like that, but that's where George was. And in that state, George prays a half-drunk prayer. And it turns out that God listens to even those. And God sends him an angel, Clarence Oddbody, angel second class. And George laments to Clarence that he wishes that he'd never been born. It's a dark place to be. And so Clarence says, okay, I'm going to show you what the world would be like, George, if you'd never been born. And for starters, if George had never been born, his little brother Harry wouldn't have gone on to be a war hero. In fact, he would be dead because George wouldn't have saved him when Harry was a young man. The pharmacist in town, Mr. Gower, would be in prison for accidentally killing a customer by giving them the wrong prescription. But George was around and helped at the pharmacy, and he caught the mistake. And if he hadn't been there, then Mr. Gower would be in prison, and that patient would have died. If George had never been born, then Mary would have grown old and never married, and she would have had no children. Their daughters and their son would have never existed. And even his hometown of Bedford wouldn't be Bedford, it'd be Pottersville, because Mr. Potter, the richest man in town, would have turned it into sort of a dirty, scummy town full of gambling, saloons and sketchy gentlemen's clubs. Everything in his world would be completely different if George had never been born. And by showing him all the things that would or wouldn't be without his existence, it sort of brought the significance of his life into focus. And he realized how precious and how good and how wonderful a gift it was for him to actually be. And it turns out there's this line at the end of it that Clarence, the angel, tells George. He said, it's strange, isn't it? that each man's life touches so many other lives that when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he? And it turns out that the ripple effects of one person's life go out so far and so large that it's kind of hard to measure. It literally echoes into eternity. So listen, by imagining, again, all the things that would or wouldn't be if a person existed, it has a way of making things really clear, and that's what I want us to do this morning. As we talk about the life of Jesus and how the world would be different if Jesus had never been born. Because listen, there's really no denying, even atheists and historians, like anyone of any credibility acknowledges that Jesus was a real person that lived. He was flesh and blood and he lived a life. Beyond that, you may have different disagreements or different ideas about what he was, but he was a real person. And I think it's inarguable that he lived one of the most consequential lives of anyone who's ever walked this earth. All you have to do is look at your calendar and the way that we count years, and you see that the life of Jesus is literally the hinge that history turns on. Everything sort of centers on who he was. I mean, this week would be totally different if Jesus had never been born. It wouldn't be the week of Christmas. And in 3 days, it wouldn't be Christmas Eve. It would just be Wednesday, the day before Thursday. There'd be no decorations, no lights, no trees, or any of that stuff, no Christmas presents, and nothing to celebrate because he is what we celebrate. And listen, all those stories that we read about, like, the shepherds wouldn't have been visited by an angel that brought good news of great joy. There'd been no news. And the star wouldn't have led the wise men to the manger. Your nativity set wouldn't be a nativity set. It'd just be a barn with a bunch of animals. The world would be a completely different place. So I want us this morning to understand the significance of the life of Jesus by imagining what the world would be like if Jesus had never been born. And we're going to start by looking at the story of Christmas. It's not the one you're probably familiar with. Usually when it comes Christmas and I preach a Christmas sermon, I open us up to Luke chapter 2 and we read the Christmas story. Maybe you've done that with your family or maybe you plan to. You should. It's a good story. But this morning we're going to read one that we usually don't. It's in the book of Revelation chapter 12, and it gives us the Christmas story from the perspective of heaven. And I'm going to warn you, it's different. It's a behind-the-scenes look at a spiritual war that took place around the birth of Jesus. So if you got a Bible or a Bible app, look at Revelation chapter 12, verses 2 through 5. It says, she was pregnant and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth. And so far, this is the story we're all familiar with, right? But buckle up. It says, then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon, and this represents Satan, with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky. That's the other angels, the fallen angels that went with Satan. And he threw them to the earth. And he stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. So Satan's plan was to try and keep Jesus from ever being born. Instead, it says she gave birth to a son who was to rule all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched away from the dragon and was caught up to God and to his throne. And it goes on after this to describe this cosmic battle between the archangel Michael and all of his angel forces, and the battle with him and between Satan and all of his angel forces. And you're thinking like, yeah, man, this is why we don't tell this story at Christmas. Like no one's favorite tradition is to gather the family around the fire and tell the story about the dragon that tries to eat babies, all right? It's not like the greatest Christmas angle, but I do want us to see like what was going on. That the enemy, his plan was to try to keep Jesus from ever being born because he knew the significance of that life. That if Jesus stepped foot on this earth would never be the same. He knew. So he tried to stop it, but luckily, he failed. For the sake of clarity, I do want us this morning, though, to just think and just imagine what it would be like if the enemy had succeeded. And there's actually a whole field of study called alternative history, where historians imagine how different things would be if certain historical events had gone a different way. So they'll pick a point in history, they call it a point of divergence, and they consider all the ripple effects caused by that event and how they'd be different if things had gone differently. Like for me personally, like I often think as a Kentucky basketball fan, how much better the world would be if Christian Laettner had missed that shot in March of 1992. Or maybe for you all here in Indiana, if Christian Watford had missed that shot in 2012. I really don't like guys named Christian, okay? And maybe in a more significant way, what if John Wilkes Booth had missed his shot at Abraham Lincoln that night in Ford's Theater? How different might this country be? What if, like Winston Churchill wrote about this, what if during the Civil War, what if Robert E. Lee had won the battle at Gettysburg? What would America look like today? What if during World War II, what if the Axis powers of Germany and Japan and Italy, like what if they had won the war? How different might our world look today? And more than any of that, what if Jesus had never been born? How different would our world be today if that had never happened? I want to think about that. First of all, think about how Jesus changed the world for women. Jesus did more to elevate the status of women than any figure in history. In ancient cultures, women were just property to be owned. That's all they were seen as, all they were viewed as. They were not equal to men. They were just property, something to be had. So they didn't have equal value. It wasn't even close. And one of the best examples of that is just to look at the breakdown of the population in ancient Rome by gender. In ancient Rome, for every 100 women, there were 140 men. So 1.4 times the amount of men as there were to women. Why that discrepancy? For comparison's sake, in the United States today, the population breaks down to about 49.5% men and 50.5% women. And the only reason there's more women than men is because women tend to live longer. So there's a few more of you out there, all right? Why were there so many more men in ancient Rome? Well, the reason is infanticide. It's the killing of babies, especially the killing of female babies. They weren't given the same value that men had. So when a baby girl was born, very often they would choose to abandon her. It's where we get the phrase to turn your back on someone. Like we say, don't turn your back on your family. Well, that comes from ancient Rome because when a baby was born, the father would witness the birth and he could decide what to do, either to pick that baby girl up or to turn his back on her, and she would be killed or just put out into the elements to die of natural causes, if you want to call them natural. It was very, very common. But you can look back at history and you can see when those numbers began to change. And the point of divergence in history is the life of Jesus. That Jesus honored women. He spoke to them with respect. He had female disciples unheard of. He allowed them to sit among the men when he taught. And women's value changed dramatically over the next couple hundred years as the church was established, because the church cared for those abandoned children. James 1:27 commands us to care for orphans and widows. Jesus changed the world for women. And women in ancient Rome, when they were widowed and their husbands died, they were fined a fee because they were seen as a drain on society. And that often forced them into situations where they were basically slaves. It was human trafficking is what it came down to. But the church came along and they said, no, we care for orphans and widows. We'll take care of them. And so they started food programs that you can read about in the book of Acts. Nothing like that ever existed before. That was brand new. No one was doing those things. In cultures like India, actually not even that long ago, it was customary for widows to burn themselves on their deceased husband's funeral pyres. In fact, before the influence of Christian missionaries, this happened a lot, so much so that Hindus in the mid-1800s accused the Christian Bible of being written by women because it held women in such high regard. No one wrote about women like the Bible did. And as a church, we still try to do our best to care for orphans and widows and to honor women. It's certainly different from men, but certainly equal to men. I love what the author and scholar Dorothy Sayers wrote. She said this. Said, perhaps it's no wonder that women were the first at the cradle and the last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. Jesus changed the world for women. Here's another one. Jesus changed the world for children. We talked about that a little bit, but there's a story in Matthew 19 where all these kids, they come running up to Jesus, and maybe you've read this before, and the disciples shoo them away. And it's not what we would expect. Like today, with the way that, men and women and dads, like we want to be involved and there for everything and care for children and have all the compassion and love and the gentleness, like we want those things. But back then, that was unheard of. See, culturally, that was the norm for men to just be distant from kids, to not have any time for them, no compassion, no like that was just not something that men did. Children weren't seen as a blessing. They were more of a thing to be endured until they grew up and could help contribute. But the idea of men being kind or caring toward children, it changed with Jesus, because what did Jesus say when the disciples said, children, get away? Jesus said, no. Let the children come to me. They're blessing, and he blessed them. Jesus valued children in a radically different way. And we mentioned earlier how common abortion was in ancient Rome. But I didn't know until I was kind of studying up for this that it wasn't just at birth that fathers had this choice to make. And fathers had the ability to choose whether children lived or died all the way up to the age of 8. Or they could be either killed, sold as slaves, or abandoned all the way up to that age. And the decision was mostly just an economic decision. Are you helpful or drain on the family survival? And the numbers, again, kind of show this. Only about half of children in ancient Rome lived beyond the age of 8. Only about half. But those numbers, again, changed when Jesus was born, because Jesus taught that all life was sacred. So followers of Jesus began to take in abandoned children. They began to adopt them, which is something that had never really, at least not in this form, existed before. And this is where orphanages and nurseries first began. So Jesus changed the world for children, and really for anyone that the world deemed is insignificant. So for the elderly, for those with illnesses, with disabilities, with special needs, Jesus came to make eye contact with people the rest of the world overlooked. And as a church, we still today want to do everything we can to see them and to love them the way that Jesus did. Because Jesus loved them and he changed the world for them. Listen, there's other places that we could look, like in the area of slavery. And I know, sadly, the church has not always been on the right side of this issue. And that is a really sad part of history, to the extent that even like some churches even tried to remove scriptures from the Bible that gave honor and elevated the status of slaves. But you can also not argue, as historians credit followers of Jesus with ending slavery. All over the world, Christians were at the forefront of those that stepped up and spoke up for them and made changes for them. In places like the Fiji Islands, human trafficking was rampant. That you could purchase a human for around $7. That's cheaper than you could have bought a cow back then. And people were sold on a regular basis until Christian missionaries reached the island. And they brought the gospel and began to tell people about Jesus and the way that he viewed people. And they planted churches all over the Fiji Islands, around 1,000 of them. And over the next few years after they arrived, human trafficking disappeared. It was non-existent. You couldn't have bought a slave for $7 million, much less $7, because Jesus totally changed the way that people are viewed. And listen, today that issue has not ended. There's an estimated 50 million people in slavery or in human trafficking today. The large majority, around 70% of those are women, and about a quarter of those are adolescents. But the church is still at the forefront of setting captives free, with Christian organizations like IJM, that's the International Justice Mission. They're on the forefront of doing everything they can to go and fight and legally set free people that are trapped in slavery. Christians are still there because Jesus cared for the least of these. Listen, there's a lot of other areas we could look at to measure the impact of the life of Christ. You could look at the areas of science and education, and most people think that those are at odds with Christianity, but they aren't. Science is merely the study of how God did it. That's what science is. And the greatest universities in our country today, places like Harvard and Yale and Brown and Princeton and NYU and so many, many more, all right? Those were all places that were started by the church. They were there for the purpose of biblical training and studying how God brought order to our world. That's how they came to exist. You could look at languages that have been translated and codified so that we can understand them. The large majority of that happened because missionaries wanted to translate the Bible into a language that unreached people groups could understand. Even the printing press, invented by Gutenberg, was invented so that we could print the Bible for mass distribution. It's all done for the ministry of the church. Poor people have been impacted by Jesus as much as anyone or more than anyone. And listen, there's always been poverty and there always will, but no organization, no institution, no religious group has done more for the care of the poor than followers of Jesus have. In the name of Jesus, there's been orphanages built in third world countries, food programs, inner city missions, foster closets built, foster banks, food banks, backpack blessings, free health clinics, and every year faith-based organizations give over $20 billion towards poverty. Listen, when there's a natural disaster, the first people to show up are often followers of Jesus. We're there to be the hands and feet of the one who showed us how to do it. All done for him. And why is that? Because Jesus said, what you've done for the least of these, you've done for me. Listen, even the very first hospitals were started, and you can trace them back to followers of Jesus. In 325 AD, there was a council of churches that got together to talk about a lot of different things. They outlined the doctrine of the Trinity. It's no small task to knock out. And while they were at it, they also decided that every time they started a church in a town, they would also start a hospital. Said if we're gonna care for people, we're gonna care for them in all the tangible ways. So with every planted church, there's a planted hospital. That's why so many hospitals and medical places today still carry a faith-based name. It's on the front of the building, because it goes back to this. And listen, I could go on and on and on talking about all the different ways that Jesus has changed our world and left his fingerprints all over it. But I think the greatest testimony to the difference the life of Jesus had made is just in the simple testimony of people that follow him. For us to say that if Jesus had never been born, and you can finish that statement. And that makes it personal. Like if Jesus had never been born, I would be like, well, where would you be? Where would your life be? What would your world look like if Jesus had never been born? I know if Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't be able to call him a friend. If you study any other world religion, or even just our Old Testament, then you know that to call God your friend isn't just shocking, it's offensive. You read the Old Testament, and that's the part of the Bible that was before Jesus was born. All right, that's what the Old Testament is. And in the Old Testament, before Jesus was born, the high priest would go to God on your behalf. You couldn't do that. The high priest would go into the Holy of Holies because you couldn't go in there. There's this barrier between you and God. And it was so significant that they would tie a rope around the high priest's ankle just in case he died while he was in there, you could pull him out because you could not go near God under any circumstances. But Jesus, he changed that. When Jesus was born and Jesus lived a perfect life and Jesus died in our place, that veil in the temple was torn and the barrier between you and God was removed so we can know Jesus and we can know God as a friend. And because Jesus was born, we can know God as Father. Did you know that throughout the entire Old Testament, before Jesus was born, God is only described as a father about 7 times? After Jesus was born in the New Testament, God is described as our Father over 150 times. Why did that change so much? Well, it changed because of Christmas. Because Jesus was born, we can call God our Father who loves us, who cares about us, who wants to be close to us, who sees everything that we're going through, and he wants to do something about it. And listen, if you're a parent, you know what it's like when your kids get hurt. And whether that's a physical hurt, an illness, something emotional, or just a heartbreak, whenever your kids are in pain, if you as a parent could snap your fingers and trade places so that you could go through it and they would never have to, you would do it in a heartbeat. And that is exactly what God, our Father, has done for us. The Bible teaches that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God became flesh so that all the pain, all the punishment that we deserve, he took that on himself. So listen, because Jesus was born, we can know God as our Father and our Savior. So if Jesus had never been born, whatever's on the other side of that sentence means everything. So how would you finish that? How would you finish that statement? And for me, if Jesus had never been born, well, I wouldn't be doing this morning. I'd have nothing to preach about. And if Jesus had never been born, I don't think I would be married to my wife. I mean, we met because we're both, working at a church and we're chasing Jesus and, kind of brought that all together. And so I don't think that would have happened. And if Jesus had never been born, I don't think we would have adopted my sons because I don't know if adoption would be a thing if Jesus hadn't been born. And if Jesus hadn't been born, I would probably just guilt myself to death. I don't know if you're like, I have that tendency just over mistakes in my past and stupid stuff I've done and said. It would just eat me alive because I'd have no way to do anything with that guilt. It would just kill me. And if Jesus had never been born, I'd have no hope for life after this life. So what about you? What about you? I asked some friends and people to kind of help me out with this and like, how would you finish this statement? So it could help us maybe think about our own lives. That if Jesus had never been born, what would your life be like? And here's some of the answers that they gave. That if Jesus had never been born, I'd still be a desperate, people-pleasing doormat. And if Jesus had never been born, I'd still be holding on to unforgiveness. If Jesus had never been born, I never would have forgiven myself. If Jesus had never been born, my friend Caitlin shared this. She said, if Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't know where my mom's at this week or have any peace about her passing. And if Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't be a very good father, a very good husband, a very good son, or a very good friend. If Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't have gotten through our infertility. If Jesus had never been born, I never would have gotten through the pain of loss. We've all lost something, someone. If Jesus had never been born, I'd be consumed with anger and bitterness at my dad. If Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't be alive. And you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, how many times that one was repeated. If Jesus had never been born, I'd have no hope of seeing my child again in heaven. If Jesus had never been born, I would have given up my battle with mental health. If Jesus had never been born, I'd still be trapped in my addiction. If Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't have had the strength to go another day. If Jesus had never been born, I wouldn't be 3 years sober. If Jesus had never been born, I'd be consumed by lust and the shame that's attached to it. If Jesus had never been born, I would have given up on life. And if Jesus had never been born, I'd have no contentment, no peace, and no hope. Listen, there is no more powerful argument for the difference that the life of Jesus makes than your personal story. So this week, heading into Christmas and the new year, I want you to just spend some time thinking about how you'd finish that sentence. If Jesus had never been born, I'm what? What difference has Jesus made in your life? Because that makes all the difference. And if you're here today and this is all new to you and you're like, listen, I'm not following Jesus and I don't know what difference he makes in my life because I don't know that he's made a difference yet, at least not one that I'm aware of, and he hasn't done all that stuff. I just want you to know he wants to do all that stuff. That he wants to change your life. He wants to give you hope. He wants to be with you through it all. He wants to do that. And if you'll let him, man, he'll make a difference because, listen, Jesus has been born. And Jesus did live. And Jesus did die for you because he loved you that much. And it makes all the difference in the world. So this morning, let Jesus make a difference in your life. And I want to close with something that C.S. Lewis said. I love the way he writes and the way he says things, but I think it fits perfectly in what we're talking about. That if Jesus had never been born, it'd be always winter, but never Christmas. Listen, if Jesus had never been born, then he wouldn't have lived a perfect life. If he hadn't been born, then he wouldn't have died in my place. And if he hadn't died in my place, then he never could have resurrected. And so we'd be dead in our sins. So I say all that to say, I'm really glad Jesus was born. It changed my life, and it changed yours too. Merry Christmas, church.